My brother-in-law looked me straight in the eye, laughed, and said, "Come on, man, you're never CEO material." Everyone at the dinner table chuckled. 5 years later, I was sitting in my corner office when HR walked in with the next interview file. I glanced at the resume, and my heart stopped. The name at the top was his. My name is Ethan Carter, and if you've ever had someone in your own family treat your dreams like a joke, you'll understand exactly how this felt. Back then, I was 26, fresh out of college, juggling part-time jobs while trying to build a career in software. I didn't have fancy clothes, a new car, or a six-figure salary. What I did have was a laptop, a notebook full of ideas, and the stubborn belief that one day my life would look different. Apparently, that was enough to make me the family punchline. My sister Olivia invited everyone over for a Sunday barbecue. It was supposed to be a relaxed afternoon, but every family gathering somehow turned into an opportunity for her husband Brandon Hayes to remind everyone how successful he was. Brandon worked for a big consulting firm. Expensive watch, luxury SUV, designer suits. He loved talking about promotions, bonuses, and people who couldn't keep up. As soon as I walked into the backyard, he looked me up and down. "Still driving that old sedan?" he asked with a grin. I laughed it off. "It still gets me where I need to go." He smirked. Guess that's one way to look at it. A few people laughed. I kept my cool. Growing up, Mom always told me, never waste your energy trying to win arguments with people who only care about appearances. I remembered those words every time Brandon opened his mouth. Later that afternoon, everyone gathered around the picnic table. Someone asked me what I'd been working on lately. I smiled. I'm building a software platform. It's still early, but I think it has potential. Brandon leaned back in his chair and let out a loud laugh. "A startup?" I nodded. "Yeah." He shook his head. "Buddy, give me a break." More laughter. He took a sip of his drink before adding, "Do you know how many people think they're going to build the next billion-dollar company? Almost all of them fail." I stayed quiet. He wasn't finished. "You know what your problem is? You're chasing dreams instead of getting a real career." I felt every pair of eyes on me. Then came the sentence I never forgot. "Ethan, you're never going to be CEO material." The table went silent for half a second. Then someone awkwardly changed the subject. Nobody defended me. Not even Olivia. That hurt more than Brandon's words. On the drive home, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to quit. Maybe Brandon was right. Maybe I was wasting my time. But another part of me, the part that refused to stay down, kept whispering, what if he's wrong? That night, instead of feeling sorry for myself, I opened my laptop. I worked until nearly 3 in the morning. No applause, no audience, just me, a keyboard, and a promise to myself. I wasn't going to prove Brandon wrong. I was going to prove my younger self right. I had no idea that decision would completely change my life. Or that one day, the man who laughed at my dream would walk into my office asking me for a job. The next morning, I walked into my tiny apartment kitchen, poured myself a cup of cheap coffee, and stared at my laptop. Brandon's words were still ringing in my ears. You're never going to be CEO material. You know what's funny? Sometimes the people who doubt you become the loudest voice in your own head. For a few days, I questioned everything.
Maybe I should stop chasing a startup. Maybe I should take the first stable office job I could find. Maybe I was dreaming too big. But every time I opened another job application, something inside me said, this isn't the life you want. So instead of quitting, I made myself a deal. For 1 year, no excuses, no complaining, no blaming anyone. I would give everything I had. If I still failed after that, at least I'd know I gave it my best shot. That became my mission. My routine completely changed. While most people were still asleep, I was already at my desk watching coding tutorials and studying business strategy. I worked freelance projects during the day just to pay rent. At night, I built my software. Weekends, those disappeared too. Friends stopped inviting me out because they already knew my answer. I'm working. It wasn't glamorous. There were nights I ate instant noodles because I couldn't justify spending money on takeout. My apartment wasn't much either. 1 bedroom, old furniture, a desk that wobbled every time I typed too fast. But every tiny sacrifice felt like another brick in something bigger. Months passed. The software slowly improved. Then reality hit. Nobody wanted to buy it. I sent emails. Nothing. I booked demos. People canceled. One investor replied with only 3 words. Not market ready. That one stung. For the first time, I slammed my laptop shut. Seriously? I muttered. I've done all this? For nothing? I almost deleted the entire project that night. Almost. Instead, I opened every piece of feedback I'd received. As painful as it was, I realized something. People weren't rejecting me. They were rejecting a product that still needed work. Those are 2 very different things. So I stopped taking it personally. I rewrote the software from scratch. It took months. While I was rebuilding everything, another family gathering rolled around. I honestly didn't want to go. But Mom insisted. You've been hiding behind that computer for weeks, she said. You need a break. The moment Brandon saw me, he smiled. So, he folded his arms. Still trying to become the next tech genius? I smiled politely. I'm making progress. He laughed. No kidding? Then he looked around the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan's still working on his Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan's still working on his billion-dollar dream. A few people chuckled again. This time, it didn't bother me. Because something had changed. I wasn't looking for their approval anymore. I already knew where I was going. Brandon noticed my reaction. Oh, come on, he said. You're not giving up. I looked him in the eye for the first time. No. He smirked. Suit yourself. I simply nodded. Guess we'll see. For a split second, his smile faded. Maybe because I didn't argue. Maybe because confidence doesn't always sound loud. Sometimes, it sounds incredibly calm. That night, I drove home without replaying his insults. Instead, I turned on my laptop, opened my code editor, and kept building. I still had no investors, no office, no employees, just one impossible dream. But for the first time, I truly believed it wasn't impossible anymore. And 3 months later, One unexpected email would change everything. 3 months later, I woke up to an email I almost ignored. The subject line read, "Interested in discussing your software?" I figured it was another rejection. Instead, it was from the operations director of a mid-sized logistics company. He tested the free version of my platform. His final sentence made me read the email twice. "I think your product can solve one of our biggest problems." I whispered, "No way." After almost a year of hearing nothing but no, someone had finally said maybe. We scheduled a video meeting. I spent 2 straight days preparing. Every feature, every question, every possible objection. I wasn't going to wing it. When the meeting started, there were 6 people on the call. Within the first 5 minutes, my hands were sweating. Then I remembered something my dad used to say. People don't invest in perfection. They invest in confidence and honesty. So when I didn't know an answer, I admitted it.
When they pointed out weaknesses, I listened instead of arguing. By the end of the meeting, the director smiled. I like working with people who can take feedback. A week later, they signed a 1-year contract. It wasn't some crazy, life-changing amount of money, but it was enough. Enough to pay my bills. Enough to improve the software. Enough to prove that someone believed in my idea. For the first time, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was building. Over the next 18 months, referrals started rolling in. 1 client became 3. 3 became 10. I hired my first employee, then my second, then a small team. We moved out of my apartment and into a tiny office downtown. Nothing fancy. Secondhand desks, cheap coffee, whiteboards covered in ideas. But every morning I unlocked that office door, I smiled, because it belonged to us. Not long after, our biggest competitor tried to buy the company. The offer looked tempting. A younger version of me would have signed the papers immediately. Instead, I politely declined. I believed we were just getting started. Turns out, I was right. 2 years later, we landed the biggest contract in company history. Everything changed almost overnight. We hired dozens of people, moved into a beautiful glass office overlooking the city, built an incredible team. Then, one Friday afternoon, I got an unexpected phone call from Mom. "You should come to dinner this weekend," she said. "It's been too long." I smiled. "I'll be there." When I walked into Olivia and Brandon's house, something felt different. The luxury SUV was gone. The expensive watch Brandon always showed off wasn't on his wrist anymore. Even his confidence seemed smaller. During dinner, he barely talked. No bragging, no jokes, no comments about my career. Honestly, it felt strange. As I was getting ready to leave, Brandon pulled me aside. "Hey, Ethan." His voice sounded different, quieter. I heard your company's doing really well." I nodded. "We've been fortunate." He forced a smile. "Good for you." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of everything he'd said years ago.
Just 3 awkward words. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what. The answer arrived less than 2 weeks later,
When HR placed a resume on my desk, and the name at the top made my heart skip a beat. Brandon Hayes. I stared at the resume for a long moment. Brandon Hayes. Same name, same work history, same phone number.
I remembered from years ago. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Well, I whispered. Didn't see that coming. There was no celebration, no evil grin, no feeling of revenge, just disbelief. Life had a strange sense of humor. A knock on my office door pulled me back. My HR director, Rachel, stepped inside. "Everything okay?" she asked. I slid the resume back onto my desk. "Yeah." She smiled. "He's actually one of the stronger applicants on paper. Good management experience, solid references." I nodded. "When's the interview?" "Tomorrow morning."
After she left, I looked out at the skyline. 5 years earlier, I would have imagined this moment 100 different ways. Back then, I thought if I ever became successful, I'd finally get to prove Brandon wrong. But standing in that office, it didn't feel the way I'd expected. Winning doesn't erase old wounds. It just changes how you look at them. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted my emotions under control before he walked in. I wasn't interviewing my brother-in-law. I was interviewing a candidate. That's the standard I wanted to keep. At exactly 9 a.m., Rachel knocked. "Your 10 o'clock is here." I nodded. "Send him in." The door opened. Brandon stepped inside carrying a black resume folder. For a split second, he looked confident. Then he looked up. Our eyes met. The color drained from his face. His feet practically froze. "Ethan?" I stood and offered my hand. "Good morning, Brandon." There was an awkward silence. He slowly shook my hand. I didn't know." "I own the company." He nodded without saying a word. Rachel looked back and forth between us. "You two know each other?" I smiled politely. "We're family." Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh." She quietly excused herself and closed the door. Now, it was just the two of us. Brandon stared around my office. The skyline, the awards, the company logo behind my desk. It finally hit him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't pretend. This was real. He swallowed hard before speaking. "I guess." He looked down at the floor. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened his resume. "I appreciate that." His shoulders relaxed just a little. And I said something he clearly wasn't expecting. "But let's keep this interview professional." He blinked. "You mean I mean exactly what I said. I pointed toward the chair. Have a seat. For the next 30 minutes, I asked him the same questions I asked every applicant. No tricks, no sarcasm, no payback. When he answered well, I acknowledged it. When I needed clarification, I asked. Nothing more, nothing less. By the end of the interview, Brandon looked more uncomfortable than when he walked in.
Not because I'd embarrassed him, because I hadn't. Sometimes respect weighs heavier than revenge. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Ethan? I looked up. I really was wrong about you. I held his gaze for a moment, then quietly replied, "We'll be in touch after HR finishes the process." He nodded once and walked out. The room fell silent. I looked down at his resume again. The decision in front of me wasn't nearly as simple as I thought. Because the question wasn't, did Brandon deserve the job? The real question was, had he truly become a different man? After Brandon walked out, I stayed in my office for a long time. His resume was still lying on my desk. 5 years ago, I would have loved this moment. Back then, I imagined myself saying something like, "Remember when you said I'd never succeed?" But now, those words felt childish. Success has a funny way of changing your priorities. I wasn't interested in making someone feel small. I'd already spent enough years feeling that way myself. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Rachel stepped back inside. "So," she sat across from me. "Personal history?" I smiled. "You could say that." She laughed. I figured. Then her expression turned serious. "Off the record?" She leaned forward. "Is there anything I should know before we move to the final hiring discussion?" I thought carefully before answering. Finally, I said, "Judge him exactly the way you judge every other applicant." She nodded. "No special treatment?" "None." "And no penalties either?" "None." She smiled. "That's fair." As she walked out, I looked out the window again. The city looked exactly the same. But somehow, I felt lighter. That afternoon, I drove to Mom's house. She opened the door with a surprised smile. "Ethan!" "I was nearby," I said. "Thought I'd stop in." We sat in the backyard with coffee, just like we used to. After a few minutes, Mom quietly asked, "Did Brandon interview today?" I looked at her. "You knew?" She sighed. "Olivia told me." I nodded. Mom stirred her coffee before speaking again. "Things haven't been easy for them." I stayed quiet. She continued. "His company downsized 6 months ago." I hadn't known that. "He searched everywhere," she said. "Interview after interview. No offers." I slowly looked down at my cup. Mom wasn't asking me to feel sorry for him. She was simply telling me the truth. Then she placed her hand on mine. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." She smiled gently. "I'm proud of the man you've become." I laughed. "You don't even know what happened in the interview." "I don't have to." She looked me straight in the eye. "The old Ethan would have wanted revenge." She squeezed my hand.
The man sitting in front of me doesn't. Her words stayed with me all the way home. The next morning, we held our final hiring meeting. Rachel presented every candidate. Strengths, weaknesses,
Experience. References. When Brandon's file came up, nobody in the room knew our history, except Rachel. The discussion stayed completely professional. One manager spoke first. He's experienced. Another added, leadership skills are solid. A third manager wasn't convinced. I think another applicant interviewed slightly better. The room went quiet. Everyone eventually looked at me. Not because I was Brandon's relative, because I was the CEO. My vote would decide it. I took a slow breath. Then I closed the resume. My decision has nothing to do with our family connection, I said. It has everything to do with what's best for this company. The room waited. I finally gave my answer, and even Rachel looked surprised. The room stayed silent. Everyone was waiting for my decision. I looked around the table before finally speaking. I've reviewed every interview, every reference, and every assessment. I paused. Based on merit, I tapped Brandon's resume. I'm offering him the position. For a second, nobody said a word. Then Rachel nodded. I think that's the right call. The meeting moved on, but I sat there for another minute after everyone left. I wasn't happy because Brandon got the job. I was happy because I knew I hadn't let my past make today's decision. That afternoon, HR called Brandon with the offer. Less than an hour later, my office phone rang. Ethan? His voice was shaky. I honestly didn't think you'd hire me. I smiled. I didn't hire my brother-in-law. There was silence. I hired the candidate who earned the position. Another long pause. Then he quietly said, I'm sorry. This time? It sounded real. Not because he needed a job. Because he finally understood what his words had done years ago. A few days later, Brandon started his first day. He treated everyone with respect, from the receptionist to the interns. The arrogant man I once knew was gone. Watching him thank the security guard on his way out one evening, I realized something. Sometimes karma doesn't destroy a person. Sometimes it changes them. Over the next few months, Brandon became one of the most dependable people on the team. He arrived early, stayed late when projects demanded it, and surprisingly, he was the first person to admit when he made a mistake. One afternoon, I walked past the training room and noticed a new intern struggling with a software issue. Before I could step in, Brandon pulled up a chair. Don't worry, he said with a smile. I made mistakes too. Let's figure it out together. I quietly kept walking. 5 years ago, that conversation would have never happened. People really can change if they're willing to face themselves.
A few weeks later, Olivia invited the family over for dinner again. I wasn't sure what to expect. The last time we'd all sat around that table, I was the joke. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Halfway through dinner, Brandon stood up and tapped his glass. I'd like to say something. The room went silent.
He looked directly at me.
Ethan,
Years ago, I laughed at your dreams. I embarrassed you in front of everyone because I thought success made me better than other people. He took a deep breath. I was wrong. No excuses, no blaming stress, no pretending it never happened. Just honesty. Then he said something that surprised everyone.
The biggest lesson I learned wasn't from losing my job. He smiled at me. It was from the man who had every reason to get even, but chose kindness instead. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Mom quietly wiped away a tear. On the drive home that night, I realized something I'd never understood before. Success isn't the corner office. It isn't the company. It isn't the money.
Real success is becoming the kind of person who doesn't let yesterday's pain decide today's character. Brandon once believed I would never succeed. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't becoming his CEO. It was refusing to become the person he used to be. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never let someone else's opinion become the limit for your future. Because the people who laugh at your dream today may one day walk through the door that dream built. If you've ever had a family member tell you that you weren't good enough, but you proved them wrong through hard work instead of revenge, I'd genuinely love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes your story might inspire someone else who's about to give up.